It was just supposed to be a weekend away on the farm, a way for us to relax, enjoy some fresh air, and get away from the stresses of everyday life. My husband John and I had been married for 5 years, and I thought we were doing just fine. In fact, everything seemed perfect. He had a good job, we had a comfortable home, and even though life wasn't always exciting, we were content. Then came the phone call. It was Greg, John's best friend. They'd known each other since high school, and Greg had been a part of our lives for as long as I could remember. He called up out of the blue, inviting us to spend the weekend on his farm. Now, Greg wasn't just any friend. He was the kind of guy you could rely on, the one you'd call if you needed help. He was dependable, down-to-earth, and always had a way of making people feel at ease. That's what made the invitation so simple. It was Greg. After all, no one would have suspected anything odd, but I remember feeling a little weird when he mentioned how quiet the farm was now that his wife had taken the kids to visit her parents for the weekend. It was like he was almost trying to convince us to come, like it was going to be just the 3 of us. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but for some reason, I felt this small unease. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, we were just going for a couple of days. What could possibly go wrong? John was excited. It'll be fun. We haven't had a chance to relax in ages. Plus, Greg said he's got some new stuff around the farm we can check out. That sounded harmless enough, so we packed up and headed out early that Saturday morning. The drive was peaceful, and by the time we arrived, the countryside had worked its magic, quiet, fresh, and perfect for unwinding. Greg was there to greet us when we pulled up. His grin was wide and his handshake firm, just like always. There was something reassuring about him, the way he made everything seem simple, even though I knew he had his own share of troubles. Still, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I smiled and hugged him, trying to push away that lingering feeling I couldn't quite place. The moment we stepped into Greg's farmhouse, it felt like we were a world away from our normal lives. The house was cozy, with old wooden floors and a large stone fireplace in the center of the living room. The place was decorated with a rustic charm, antique furniture, vintage farm tools hanging on the walls, and warm, earthy tones. It was charming, and you could tell Greg had put a lot of effort into making it feel like home. We sat down to lunch. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did when Greg was around. We caught up on the latest news, talked about old friends, and laughed about memories from the past. There was nothing about the afternoon that screamed anything out of the ordinary, but somehow I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. John was his usual self, relaxed, enjoying the easy pace of the farm. He always had a way of letting his guard down around Greg. Something about their friendship made him feel comfortable, maybe even a little too comfortable. I didn't think much of it at first, but now that I look back, maybe that was the first sign. After lunch, Greg suggested we go for a walk around the property, just to show us the new improvements he'd made. I agreed, but I noticed that John was more interested in checking out the barn, something he'd never cared about before. It was just another little detail, but in that moment, it made me feel like there was some kind of unspoken energy between Greg and me. Greg led the way, and I followed, trying to push the feeling of unease aside. The farm was beautiful, fields stretching out in all directions, a small pond in the distance, and the sound of birds chirping. Everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. We walked in silence for a while, Greg pointing out new animals he'd acquired and telling me about his plans for the property. It wasn't until we reached the edge of the woods that things began to shift. We stopped by a small bench near the trees, and Greg sat down. I was standing next to him, looking out over the land, when he suddenly turned to me. His eyes were different, like there was something more behind them. I didn't understand it at first, but it hit me then. I was suddenly aware of how close we were, too close. I stepped back, but he reached out and touched my arm gently. The moment lingered, and I could feel my heart beating faster. Something in my gut told me this wasn't just a friendly gesture, but I still didn't know what to think. Before I could react, John's voice called out from the barn in the distance, snapping me back to reality. Greg quickly withdrew his hand, and we both stood there awkwardly for a moment. "Let's head back," he said, his tone a little too casual. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew that whatever was happening between Greg and me couldn't just be ignored. Later that evening, we sat around the dinner table, enjoying the warmth of the fire and Greg's homemade stew. I'd tried to push the strange moment from my mind, but I couldn't. There was a heaviness in the air, something between us that hadn't been there before. I felt tense, and I noticed Greg kept stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I just smiled and kept eating, pretending like everything was fine. The conversation turned to wine, and Greg suggested we have a glass or two to relax. I was hesitant, but John was all for it. "It'll be fun," he said. "We never get a chance to unwind like this." So we poured ourselves some wine, and the evening started to feel a little lighter, but as the hours passed, I began to feel a little more than tipsy. That's when things started to change. Greg became more charming, more flirtatious, and I couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered on me. I could see the way he looked at me differently now. The tension between us was palpable, but I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the alcohol, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. John, of course, was oblivious. He'd had a few drinks himself, and by this point, he was talking about some work stuff with Greg, completely unaware of the dynamic that had shifted between us. As the night wore on, I could feel the space between Greg and me closing. We were sitting closer, and I couldn't ignore the heat in the air. My heart raced a little faster with each passing moment. I felt like I was losing control of the situation. But it wasn't until Greg's hand brushed mine, just a casual touch, as if it was an accident, that I realized I wasn't imagining anything. He knew exactly what he was doing, and so did I. But what was I supposed to do now? He said something about the firelight playing tricks on him, but he didn't laugh. Instead, his gaze lingered a little longer than it should have, and I could feel the heat radiating off his body. It wasn't just the compliment. It was the way he said it, like it meant something more. I felt myself getting lost in the moment, my thoughts racing as I wondered what he really wanted. "I've always thought you were beautiful," Greg continued, his voice even quieter now, "but you've always been with John." I respect that. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like if things were different. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. Was he really saying what I thought he was saying? Was he really implying something more than just a compliment? My mind was spinning, but before I could gather my thoughts, John came back into the room, interrupting the moment. Greg quickly straightened up, and I pretended like nothing had happened, but my heart was racing. I could feel the electricity in the air, and I knew that nothing was the same between us anymore. John didn't seem to notice anything. He sat down and started talking about some new project he was working on, completely unaware of the tension hanging between Greg and me. I tried to focus on what John was saying, but all I could think about was the way Greg had looked at me and the words he had said. My mind was a mess, and I didn't know how to make sense of it all. The next day, things didn't get any better. In fact, they only got worse. I couldn't stop thinking about what Greg had said the night before. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just a fluke, that maybe I had misinterpreted his words, but deep down, I knew what had happened. Greg had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure if I could just forget it. We spent the day outside, walking around the property, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was watching me a little too closely. Every time I turned around, his eyes were on me, and it made my stomach turn. I tried to stay focused on the task at hand, but I couldn't help feeling like I was on edge, like something was about to happen and I didn't know how to stop it. We were in the barn, helping Greg with some work when it happened. John was off to the side fixing something on the tractor, and Greg and I were alone for a few minutes. I should have taken that as a sign to walk away, but I didn't. That's when Greg moved closer. He stood behind me, his breath warm on the back of my neck as he reached over me to grab a tool from the shelf. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the tension building between us. This was it, the moment I had been dreading. I could feel his hand brush against my arm, and for a second, it felt like everything around us disappeared. There was just him, and there was just me, and for a brief moment, I considered letting it happen. I could have turned around, kissed him, and let whatever was between us unfold. But then, just as quickly, reality hit me like a ton of bricks. What was I doing? What was I even thinking? I pulled away quickly, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I should go check on John, I stammered, barely able to get the words out. But Greg didn't move. He stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable, before nodding silently. And as I turned to walk away, I couldn't help but feel like I had just escaped something that could have changed everything. I stood there, silently watching the door close, taking John's silhouette with it. My heart shattered into pieces, and the guilt burned in my chest. I had made an unforgivable mistake. All I wanted now was to turn back time, to stop myself in that moment of weakness, but that was impossible. The house became eerily silent, with only the ticking of the wall clock breaking the stillness. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind spinning with thoughts. Would John ever forgive me? Could this marriage still be saved? Or was it all over? The next morning, John wasn't home. He left a note on the kitchen table. I need time to think. Don't contact me for now. The brief message felt like a dagger piercing my heart. I understood he needed space to process everything, but his silence terrified me more than any words of anger could. That entire day, I tried to keep myself busy, doing housework, tending to the garden, but nothing seemed to matter. My mind kept returning to John's pained expression and Greg's reckless confession. I realized I needed to do something to fix this, even if nothing could truly make up for my mistake. I sat down and wrote John a letter. I poured out all my thoughts and emotions, from the moment of weakness, my fears, to the love I still had for him. I didn't try to justify my actions. I just wanted him to know how deeply sorry I was and that I was willing to do anything to make amends. As I folded the letter, tears fell and soaked the edges of the paper. I placed it on the table, hoping that when John returned, he would read it and understand that, despite my mistake, my love for him had never wavered. Day by day, I lived in waiting. Greg disappeared from our lives, like a passing wind, leaving chaos and pain behind. After a week, John came back. He walked into the house, his eyes tired, but no longer filled with anger. He held the letter I had left, but said nothing. "John," I spoke softly, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "I read the letter," he said, his tone calm but heavy. "I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were, but I'm willing to try. It won't be easy, and I need to see change from you." His words were like a small ray of light piercing through the darkness. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but as long as John gave me a chance, I would do everything in my power to prove that my love for him was real and that I would never let him down again.